Your special person once reached a point where they thought the easiest way to silence their feelings was to erase them, not understand them, not face them, not admit them, erase them. Something happened last night that brought that hidden struggle to the surface, and the story that follows is written as a spiritual, fictional-style message for reflection. Not as a claim that a psychic can literally predict your future or control another person's mind. Imagine this moment. The room is quiet. The lights are low. Someone is sitting across from a person they believe might have the answers they have been desperately searching for. They have carried the same question for weeks, perhaps months. And finally they decide they cannot carry it anymore. They do not come there asking how to find you. They do not come asking how to make you love them. They do not even come asking whether you still think about them. They come with one request: help me forget. Those 3 words sound simple, but behind them is an entire story. Because people rarely ask to forget someone they genuinely feel nothing for. They ask to forget when remembering has become emotionally exhausting. They ask to forget when every ordinary moment seems to bring the person back. A song becomes a reminder. A familiar place becomes a reminder. A certain time of night becomes a reminder. A message notification creates a sudden rush of expectation. Even silence becomes a reminder, and somewhere inside your special person's mind, there may have been a battle between what they believed they should do and what they actually felt. That battle is what made last night so significant within this symbolic story. They wanted an ending. But what they discovered was that an ending cannot always be forced simply because someone is tired of waiting. They thought they could walk into a room, explain the situation, hear some reassuring words, and walk back out emotionally untouched. Instead, the conversation became something completely different. The psychic listened. She did not immediately answer. She watched their expression change as they described the situation. They talked about distance. They talked about confusion. They talked about moments they could not explain. They talked about things they wished they had never said. They talked about things they wished they had said much earlier. And eventually, your name, or the memory of you, became impossible to avoid. That was when the atmosphere changed, because sometimes the person who wants to forget is not actually trying to forget another person. They are trying to forget the version of themselves that appeared when they were around that person, the softer version, the vulnerable version, the version that cared, the version that became afraid of losing something meaningful. The version that suddenly realized that control was not enough. Your special person may have spent a long time pretending they were unaffected. Maybe they acted distant. Maybe they became inconsistent. Maybe they convinced themselves that silence was easier than honesty. Maybe they tried to focus on other things. Maybe they told themselves that enough time would eventually make the memories disappear. But the human heart does not always follow the schedule the mind creates, and that is where the symbolic message becomes powerful. The psychic supposedly told them something they were not prepared to hear. She said, in essence, that forgetting someone is not the same as healing from what happened. That sentence landed differently, because they had been thinking about forgetting. They had not been thinking about healing. They had been trying to escape the feeling instead of understanding it. they had been trying to close the door without asking why the door mattered so much, and suddenly, every unanswered question came rushing back. Why did they still care? Why did certain memories still affect them? Why did they become emotional when someone mentioned you? Why did they sometimes wonder what you were doing? Why did they still imagine conversations that never happened? Why did part of them want to move forward while another part kept looking backward? The answer was not necessarily destiny. The answer was not necessarily that you were guaranteed to be together. The answer was much more human. They had unfinished emotions, and unfinished emotions do not disappear simply because someone commands them to. That realization broke something open inside them, not because the psychic had supernatural power, but because the conversation forced them to stop running from their own feelings. They had been waiting for someone else to give them permission to forget. Instead, they were confronted with the possibility that what they really needed was honesty. Honesty about what they felt, honesty about what happened, honesty about what they regretted, honesty about what they wanted, and honesty about what they were afraid to admit. That is where this message becomes personal for you. There may have been moments when you wondered whether your special person ever cared. There may have been moments when their silence made you question everything. You might have wondered whether they had moved on, whether they had forgotten, whether you mattered, whether the memories were one-sided. But silence does not automatically mean absence of emotion. At the same time, emotion does not automatically mean someone is ready for a relationship. That distinction matters. Someone can care deeply and still be confused. Someone can miss you and still need time to grow. Someone can regret their choices and still not know what to do next. Someone can think about you without being prepared to return. That is why the most important part of this message is not the psychic. It is the emotional truth underneath the story. Your special person may have wanted a shortcut. They wanted a clean answer. They wanted somebody to tell them what to feel. But emotions do not always offer clean answers. Sometimes the answer is uncomfortable. Sometimes the answer is that you mattered. Sometimes the answer is that they were afraid. Sometimes the answer is that they handled something badly. Sometimes the answer is that they need to become more honest before they can make any meaningful decision. And sometimes the answer is simply that two people can deeply affect one another without knowing what the final chapter will be. That uncertainty may be exactly what frightened them. They wanted certainty. Instead, they received a mirror. The conversation made them look at themselves. And what they saw was not the person who had everything figured out. They saw someone who had been avoiding difficult emotions. Someone who had tried to appear stronger than they felt. Someone who had convinced themselves that moving away emotionally would be easier than admitting that something mattered. Perhaps they remembered the first moment they realized you were different. Maybe it was not dramatic. Maybe nothing extraordinary happened. Maybe it was simply a conversation, a glance, a small kindness, a moment when you understood something without being asked. Those ordinary moments often become the memories people carry longest. They may have remembered how comfortable the connection once felt. They may have remembered laughter. They may have remembered tension. They may have remembered disagreements. They may have remembered the moments when neither of you knew what to say. And then came the question, if forgetting were really what I wanted, why am I still talking about this? That question changed everything. Because sometimes the strongest evidence that something matters is not how loudly we speak about it. It is how hard we work to avoid speaking about it. They had tried distraction. They had tried distance. They had tried telling themselves that the past was the past. But last night, the story they had been telling themselves became harder to believe. The psychic's words, in this fictional spiritual narrative, did not magically control their emotions. Instead, they acted like a trigger for reflection. She encouraged them to consider whether they were seeking peace or simply seeking escape. Those are not the same thing. Peace allows you to acknowledge what happened. Escape tries to make the memory disappear. And suddenly your special person had to confront that distinction. They may have realized they were not actually angry at you. They may have been angry at themselves, angry about missed opportunities, angry about poor communication, angry about pride, angry about fear, angry about the moments when they chose silence because speaking honestly felt too risky. And regret has a strange way of appearing when the world becomes quiet. During the day, there are distractions. People talk, phones ring. Responsibilities demand attention, but at night, the mind becomes louder. That may be why the title of this message begins with something happening last night. Nighttime often represents the moment when the distractions disappear. The person is alone with their thoughts. And thoughts that were easy to suppress during the day suddenly become impossible to ignore. Maybe they stared at the ceiling. Maybe they replayed an old conversation. Maybe they wondered what would happen if they had made different choices. Maybe they asked themselves whether you had already moved on. Maybe they wondered whether you still remembered them. Maybe they imagined what they would say if they ever had another honest conversation with you. But imagination is not proof. Thoughts are not promises, and feelings are not guarantees. What matters is what someone chooses to do with those feelings. That is the deeper lesson hidden inside this dramatic story. You do not need to chase someone simply because they may miss you. You do not need to interpret every coincidence as a sign. You do not need to wait indefinitely for someone to become ready. Your life continues regardless of what another person decides. And if this message speaks to something inside you, let it remind you that your worth is not determined by whether someone remembers you. You are worthy even when someone is confused. You are worthy even when someone is silent. You are worthy even when someone cannot give you the answer you want. You are worthy without needing a psychic, a prediction, or a supernatural confirmation. That is important. Because the most beautiful part of this story is not that someone supposedly tried to erase you. It is that the attempt to escape their feelings forced them to understand themselves better. Maybe they realized that forgetting was never the real solution. Maybe they realized they needed to forgive themselves. Maybe they realized they needed to accept that the past happened. Maybe they realized that if they ever spoke to you again, they would need to speak differently, not with games, not with manipulation, not with vague hints, not with emotional confusion, but with honesty. That is the kind of transformation that actually matters. Imagine them leaving that room. The night air feels different. Nothing outside has magically changed. the streets are the same, the buildings are the same. The world has not suddenly rearranged itself, but something inside them has shifted. They no longer feel like they can simply bury the question, they know they have to face it, and perhaps the question is no longer, how do I forget? Perhaps the question has become, what do I need to understand? That is a completely different question. It opens a different door. Understanding does not mean returning. It does not mean reconciliation is guaranteed. It does not mean the past should be repeated. It means learning why something affected you, learning what you could have done differently, learning what boundaries matter, learning what honesty requires, learning how fear can make people behave in ways that later become difficult to explain. Your special person may have discovered that they were not only carrying memories of you, they were carrying memories of choices they made around you, and sometimes that is what hurts most. You can miss a person, but you can also miss the person you were before you made a mistake. You can wish you had been braver. You can wish you had spoken sooner. You can wish you had listened better. You can wish you had not allowed pride to decide for you. That kind of regret can be heavy, but regret can also become a teacher. It can show someone what they need to change. Maybe this is why the message says the words broke them completely, not literally, not in a dangerous sense, but emotionally. The conversation may have broken down a wall they had built around themselves, the wall of denial, the wall of pride, the wall of pretending, and behind that wall were feelings they had refused to examine. They may have finally admitted, I still care. Perhaps they did not say it to anyone. Perhaps they only admitted it privately. But admitting something privately can still be powerful. Because every transformation begins with honesty, before someone can change their behavior, they must recognize their behavior. Before they can repair something, they must acknowledge that it was damaged. Before they can apologize, they must admit they were wrong. Before they can move forward, they must understand what they are carrying, and maybe that was the real message hidden inside last night. Not, they are definitely coming back. Not, they are guaranteed to contact you. Not, a psychic has revealed your future. The deeper message is, something unresolved deserves honest reflection. If your special person truly cares, their actions will eventually tell you more than any prediction. If they are ready, they will communicate clearly. If they have changed, you will see. Consistency. If they want to repair something, they will take responsibility. You should never have to decode someone's feelings forever. You deserve clarity. You deserve respect. You deserve communication that does not leave you constantly guessing. And perhaps, somewhere in this symbolic story, your special person is learning exactly that. They are learning that caring about someone is not enough. You must also know how to treat them. You must know how to communicate. You must know how to respect boundaries. You must know how to take responsibility for your decisions. You must understand that love, affection, or emotional attachment does not erase the consequences of hurtful behavior. Maybe that is what the psychic's message truly revealed. Not a prediction, a responsibility. The responsibility to become honest. The responsibility to stop running. The responsibility to stop asking someone else to erase what you refuse to understand. And that realization may have been painful, but pain is not always punishment. Sometimes discomfort is the beginning of growth. Sometimes the hardest truth is the one that finally sets someone free. Your special person may have wanted to forget because remembering reminded them of uncertainty. But perhaps they learned that uncertainty is not always something to eliminate. Sometimes uncertainty simply means there are things you cannot control. You cannot control another person's feelings. You cannot control their timing. You cannot control whether they return. You cannot control whether they understand you. You cannot control whether they choose courage, but you can control your own response. You can choose peace. You can choose self-respect. You can choose patience without putting your entire life on hold. You can choose hope without turning hope into certainty. You can choose to care without losing yourself, and that is where this message turns back toward you. Perhaps you have spent too much time asking what your special person is doing, what they are thinking, whether they miss you, whether they regret something, whether they will come back. But maybe there is another question waiting for you. What do you want? Not what does destiny supposedly want, not what does a psychic supposedly see, not what does someone else's silence supposedly mean. What do you want? Do you want clarity? Do you want peace? Do you want a sincere conversation? Do you want closure? Do you want a relationship built on mutual effort? Do you want to move forward? Your answer matters, because a soulmate-style story should never become a reason to abandon your own judgment. If someone returns, look at their actions. If someone apologizes, consider whether their behavior changes. If someone says they care, notice whether their choices demonstrate care. Words can open a door. Consistency tells you whether someone is actually walking through it, and perhaps your special person is beginning to understand that. Maybe last night forced them to confront a truth they had avoided for a long time. You cannot erase a meaningful chapter simply because you are uncomfortable with how it ended. You can learn from it. You can grow from it. You can make different choices. You can forgive. You can apologize. You can move forward. But pretending it never mattered does not create peace. It only creates silence. And silence is not the same as healing. That may be why they were emotionally shaken. They thought they were going to receive an easy answer. Instead, they received a difficult question. What if the real thing they needed to forget was not you? What if they needed to forget the fear that kept them from being honest? What if they needed to forget the belief that vulnerability equals weakness? What if they needed to forget the habit of running whenever emotions become complicated? What if they needed to forget the version of themselves that believed silence was safer than truth? Those questions can change a person, and perhaps that is what this fictional message is really about. Not supernatural certainty, transformation. There is a moment in every person's life when avoidance stops working. The memories return. The questions return, the lessons return, and eventually, you have to decide what you will do with them. Maybe your special person reached that moment last night. Maybe they finally stopped asking how to erase the past. Maybe they started asking what the past was trying to teach them. And if they ever come back into your life, perhaps the most important thing will not be whether they remember you. It will be whether they remember the lesson. because remembering you without changing would accomplish very little. Remembering you and repeating the same mistakes would only reopen old wounds. But remembering what happened, understanding why it happened, and becoming more honest could mean something entirely different. That would be growth, and growth cannot be predicted by anyone. It has to be demonstrated. So if you are listening to this message while wondering whether someone from your past still thinks about you, take a breath. You do not need to solve the mystery tonight. You do not need to search for signs in every little event. You do not need to force an answer. Let reality reveal itself through time and behavior. If someone wants to speak to you, they can choose respectful communication. If someone wants to rebuild trust, they can show consistency. If someone wants another chance, they can demonstrate accountability. And if they do not, you are still allowed to continue your life. Your future is not trapped inside another person's decision. Your peace does not belong to another person's hands. Your value does not rise or fall depending on whether someone misses you, and your heart deserves something real. That is the strongest message hidden inside the dramatic title. The attempt to forget did not create the breakthrough, honesty did. The psychic did not magically reveal your destiny. The conversation simply forced someone to look at feelings they had been avoiding. And sometimes that is enough to change the